Strategies for Successful College Writing. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Writing Center today, and we're going to talk about ways to do your writing a little easier, more clearly, more likely to get a good grade. And this is the starting point in a larger series. So if you are new to ACU, coming back after an absence, or have been here for a while, I hope that you learned something today, and please feel free to ask questions. We have an open format, which is to say we have provision here for moving the content in different directions based on what you, the attendees, tell us you want and need. And I've had some write-in requests for things to talk about that we'll get to, but if you have something you want to share, please type in the chat window. If you'd like to share that privately, you can also send me a private message. Again, we're here for strategies for successful college writing, and please tell me what program you're in. For example, you could be undergraduate psychology major, you could be in one of our master's or doctoral programs, and that just lets me know who's here today and what examples would be most beneficial to everyone in attendance. A little bit about the ACU Online, sorry, a little bit about the ACU Online Writing Center. So we are a resource that works with students in just about every graduate program and undergraduate program we have through the Dallas campus, which is to say, if you are a student, are happy to work with you through webinars and answering emails. I believe the only exception for our one-on-one appointments right now is the Graduate School of Theology, but we'll still answer questions, and you're certainly welcome to attend our webinars. Most of our students work with us through what we call asynchronous appointments, which is to say these are not at appointments in real time. This is a good thing because you could have your appointment at 11:30 at night, and provided you upload your paper by 11:30 at night, you don't need to stay up. Read it. We'll get back to you within 24 hours with comments and suggestions and answers to any questions you include. But the idea is you schedule a specific time, and by that time, you upload a copy of your paper. So if you're looking at the schedule and you say, I've got a paper due in 2 Thursdays, I want to schedule an appointment the Tuesday before that, you can go ahead and schedule that now and make sure that you have a slot. And then, so long as you make your appointment by that time, you're good. If you just joined us, please do introduce yourself and let me know what program you're in, because one of the things we do in this and similar webinars is we refer students to resources that are specifically relevant and of interest to them where they are right now. And if you are, say, a master's student in your second term in the counseling program, there might be some things that we refer you to that would be different from if you were, say, a first semester EDD a student, and we could say, oh, there is actually an assignment related to your class where we have a resource that's will be very helpful to you in, say, a week. So please let us know where you're joining us from. So in addition to asynchronous appointments, you can also send us an email that's just as to online writing center at acu.edu. You can also request when you make an appointment that we have a real-time consultation. Now, those are granted as staff availability permits. We're really busy right now because of all the things that are coming in for the semester, but a good time to catch us for those is on week 0. Say you receive feedback on your final paper and you say, I'd like to just sit down and focus on how can I do better in the next term. Week 0 is a great time to ask for that. If you wanted to ask for that in week 7, well, that's probably the busiest time of the term, so not so great. But certainly week 0, week 1, not a problem. We work with people at any stage of your writing, so you could be just starting out on your draft and interpreting the instructions. You could be working on a partial draft or an outline, or you could have a complete thing that you have turned in and you want to get feedback on, or you just want another set of eyes before you turn it in. All that's fine. I have people requesting all of those things every week. We have a large variety of sample papers and blog posts at the Online Writing Center and various topics. And I think it's probably a good thing if we take a look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the Online Writing Center website. And let me switch the share there. So one of the things to be aware of is that there are many students who've come through before you. And if you're just trying to get an idea of, hold on, what 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 are the options available to me? Well, for many things, we have examples that are available for you. And this is growing every semester as we add more sample papers. So say you have just arrived at ACU and you're wondering, for my degree program, are there a couple examples that I could look at just to get an idea of what do people want, to look at a real practical example. And so you could go here and let's say you're a first semester EDD student and you're taking Leadership 701. So I've loaded up the sample papers page on the website and I selected Lead 701 here. And you can see there are a couple examples of different things that people have produced here. Now we update these as they go along, so we'll have some APA 7th edition ones coming along. But this will give you an example of, okay, this is the kind of thing that people have done. These aren't perfect papers, so these are samples of student work. So you may find occasional things that you would do differently. But again, the idea is to be able to ground what you're looking at in samples of actual student work. Similarly, if we were looking at, say, the DMP program, we've got a couple examples there. And for example, if you were in the marriage and family therapy, we have some related resources. So let us turn back to the main presentation here. And again, if you just joined us, please let me know what program you're in and what brings you here. So perhaps you have a specific question related to an assignment. Perhaps you're just looking to, in general, improve your understanding of what's expected and how to meet that. I spoke about this a little bit, but just to return to that sending in a paper in for feedback, the first step is always to schedule an appointment on WC Online. The second is by the time of your appointment to submit your paper through Canvas, and then we send you feedback within 24 hours. Now, sometimes you are looking for feedback on a shorter circuit. Perhaps you have 2 hours before the paper is due, and you just really want to get another set of eyes really fast, and you don't have an appointment scheduled already. Well, through tutor.com, and that is www.tutor.com. Type the link in the chat window. Through tutor.com, ACU has an institutional subscription, which gives each and every one of you 10 free hours of access to tutor.com. Now, I believe that is 10 hours per term, but that's evolved over the years, so don't quote me on that. But regardless, you get a minimum of 10 hours, and then that resets at certain intervals. So one of the great things about tutor.com is that you log into the website, and then you can meet with a tutor, usually with less than 10 minutes wait. I think when I've tried in finals time, the longest I ever had to wait was 5. But they have some staff who are waiting and will be able to respond. Now, the folks at tutor.com can give you general writing feedback. They're not necessarily experts in APA style, and they don't have the same familiarity with the assignments that my team does. So what they do give you is a quick set of eyes. So I'd say go in with specific questions, and they will be better able to work with you. Similar thing comes when you are submitting your paper for feedback. You could just send us the paper and we'll look at it and we'll give you comments. But very likely you have some specific areas of concern that you are more interested in getting feedback on. For example, you might have something where your professors remarked, work on your synthesis, or it would benefit from having clear topic sentences. And so you might ask, hey, on this page, is my synthesis clear? Or I've been working on my topic sentences. Do those align with the paragraphs? And then we'll be able to give you more specific feedback that aligns with what exactly you're looking for. This is especially true if you're submitting longer papers, say 10 or more pages. In a 30-minute appointment, there's only so much you can look at. So if you tell us areas that you are most interested in seeing that feedback, we can customize things accordingly. Some webinars that may be of interest to you. uh, We have coming up next Tuesday, my colleague Julie Johnson Archer is teaching literary analysis in the Bible. I'm doing a formatting figures and tables in APA 7th edition next Thursday. There are a number of programs that require you to prepare or analyze tables, and we'll be talking about that. We have Avoiding Plagiarism with APA 7 coming up Tuesday, the 10th of November. That is not just about plagiarism, but also about how to correctly mark and acknowledge your sources in APA style. And if you're working on one of those papers where you're submitting drafts all term, you really want to have good note taking through your citations so you can find where you got the information from quickly. So if that applies to you, strongly recommend going to see that. You can also watch recordings of that online through our website. And coming up on Tuesday the 17th, we have a psychology reflection papers assignment. There are other programs that do require that you write reflection papers, some at the beginning of the term, some at the end. And I will say that is a webinar that there's a lot about writing reflection paper, period, that would be of interest to you, regardless of whether you're taking our psychology sequence or not. So it happens that the specific examples being used in that are from undergraduate psychology classes. The general principles apply. Some webinars that work well in partnership with this. If you're wondering, okay, well, how exactly do I do these things? He's talking about an APA style. We got a dedicated webinar from that. You can watch a recording for that immediately. And if you are writing about religion and your personal beliefs related to that and want to be able to cite Christian scripture, we've got another webinar on that too. All right, let's talk now about some of the things that make for strong academic writing generally. And we'll drill down into some concrete actions later. But let's start with general characteristics. One of these is structure. And this is something where I will say the public school system over the last 20 years has really not done us a lot of favors. Because over the last 20 years, there's been such an increase in teaching what's called the 5-paragraph essay structure, because the 5-paragraph essay is used as a basis for a lot of college admission exams and related things like advanced placement tests. And so there has become this confusion where sometimes people believe that all their papers are supposed to be written with just 5 paragraphs. And so I'll get a draft coming in and it'll be 2 or 3 pages per paragraph. And that is an example of not having a logical structure, because you have all sorts of different arguments crammed together and you can't really see clearly where each begins and ends. And if you separate that so that there is a clear division, and each paragraph starts with a topic sentence that lays out, here's what the paragraph is about. You follow up with evidence and argumentation, and then you have a concluding or transitioning sentence. That gives you a nice clear structure. You can say, oh, I see what they are saying here. I can stop and think about that if I need to process this, and then you move on. You also want to have explicit argumentation here. And then by explicit, I do not mean yelling, cursing, that kind of thing. I mean being clear about what you write. Now, in all of in all of ACU's online programs, except for the Graduate School of Theology, we use APA style. And one of the things that APA style does is it emphasizes just being clear about what you say. Now, I don't know where all of you are joining us from geographically. I've lived and worked around this country and in a couple others. And I can tell you that communication practices and habits can vary tremendously by region. For example, when I moved to Minnesota, I discovered what we call, with some fondness, passive-aggressive communication. Now, if you've dealt with passive-aggressive communication, you know that it can sometimes take a while to figure out what people are telling you. And this can be done for polite reasons, where people don't want to upset you or embarrass you by just out and saying things. But let me introduce a little bit of Minnesotan speech. So if someone hears you say something and they think it's a stupid idea, what you would say to them is, that's a thing. You're not going to say, that's a bad thing or that's a terrible idea. You say, that's a thing. Now, if you said that to me living in Massachusetts, then I would think, oh, well, you're saying, yeah, that's a way you could do it. Great. They're on board with this, which is totally not the message that is trying to be relayed, which is why a system like APA style says, just be explicit, say exactly what you mean, be very literal, and then there's no confusion. Now, when I lived in the American South, for example, in Tennessee, we had other ways of communicating too, of which many of you are probably familiar with the expression, bless your heart, which in some other parts of the country can mean like, oh, you're such a great person, and I'm so thankful. And when I was in Tennessee, it meant more of the, yeah, crazy, or something to that effect. Sometimes that's dumb, depending on the inflection and that you put on it. So to avoid this kind of confusion, we want to be as direct as possible. So, for example, there is an assignment in the marriage and family therapy program where you are asked to describe a situation that was not comfortable and how you navigated the communication demands. And you could say very directly, a situation that made me uncomfortable was X. And we would know you were describing that. You could also say it or write it something along the lines of, a situation that caused me great thought and made me ponder for a time was. And it's not that a reasonably intelligent person might not eventually figure out what you're talking about, especially if there's a little context and with some follow up. But it's not as clear, it's not as explicit that, oh, you are telling the reader exactly what the assignment asked you to do. We also want to have clear and convincing evidence that is appropriate to the scope. Now, this is one of those things where if you tell me a little bit about what areas interest you, I might customize these examples a little bit. So please tell me a little bit about research areas or practice areas that interest you. But for example, I have many students right now who are working on public school education in the United States, and specifically about trying to reform classroom interactions between students and teachers. Now, you could roll back the clock and start talking about one room classrooms in 19th century America. But remember the prompt here, clear, convincing evidence appropriate to the scope. Now, certainly there are places where it's important to understand where we came from. But if you're talking about education right now, and you're not specifically being asked to give a history lesson, you're probably much more concerned with the No Child Left Behind Act, which was passed in the early 2000s, and then the Common Core legislation that implemented following educational reforms in the early 2010s. Because those are things that have profoundly changed American education and also changed the background, expectations, and experiences that people coming into college and graduate programs bring with them based on all the time up to this point. So while, yes, there may be some things that are interesting to know from talking about education in the 19th century, if we back things up to the period that has directly affected the people you are trying to work with and affect, it will both be more manageable and more clearly relevant to your reader. Another thing to do is to keep track of when you're being asked to give a summary, when you're just relaying things that other people have written or said, and when you are supposed to be synthesizing. Now, this is something that comes up increasingly when you are in upper class as student, uh, as in a junior or senior, and especially when you're a master's student and doctoral student, where you're supposed to be creating new meaning, not just saying, oh, so and so said this, but applying this to a new setting, to a new context, and deriving thus new information from that synthesis process. Taking into account A and B, we should do C. That is an example of synthesis. And we always want to have clear connections back to whatever the topic or thesis is that is guiding the paper. Some examples of things that you want to be doing to achieve these things. First, use punctuation to clarify connections. One of the reasons I often ask my students to read their text out loud is because I can see what sort of meaning they are attaching by the pauses that they put between words. And those pauses can be captured or shown through different punctuation. If I am reading text aloud, a period has a much longer pause after it than a semicolon, because the period, that pause is telling the reader, oh, we are done with this idea. We're done with this sentence. And so when you read that, usually you take a moment to at least subconsciously process and say, okay, did I understand that, or am I going to read that again or think about it for a little bit? Similarly, a semicolon has a long pause, but not quite as long as a comma. And those pauses are really what help us see how the words are connected. We also want to use specific words for specific meanings. I have had students who used the thesaurus tool in Microsoft Word, and so they go in and they just right-click on a word and select something from the thesaurus. And then I'd ask them things like, okay, so what exactly do you mean by pontificating? And they'd say, I don't actually know. It just seemed a cool word. And if you're meaning pontificating as in talking down to someone, or the literal meaning of speaking as the Pope, that is very different than if you were trying to say someone said that, which is what they had began with, and somehow they ended up with pontificated through one synonym to another. So make sure that you understand what you are referring to when you use a word. APA style, again, is used for all but the Graduate School of Theology online programs. APA style emphasizes accuracy, precision, and clarity over variety. So you want to be using the same words to refer to the same thing. So we know, oh, yes, this is the same. All right, on the sentence level, use a sentence to express one complete thought. Use the paragraphs to focus on particular points, and the sections to organize sets of related ideas. Now, the sections will come up more as you start writing papers that are, 3 pages or longer. If you are writing something that is 5 pages or more, you probably want to have some clearly marked sections with headings. Other things about what makes good, strong academic writing. You want it to not be emotional. Try and avoid writing things like unfortunately or tragically. And it's not that those might not be true, but they are both emotional and subjective, and that weakens the argument because it's easier to dispute them. For example, think of anything related to politics, and you can probably find some different opinions about whether something is good or bad. I will take an example from my personal history. So I lived in the town of Brookline in Massachusetts that has a busing program. And you could look at that and say, okay, this busing program is good for students who are being bused in because the schools are really high quality. Or you could look at it as one of my students did and say, well, hold on, these buses are taking hours out of the students' lives each day. It would be more productive for them to go to a neighborhood school where they can then spend that time more on other activities. Now, ultimately, I couldn't tell you which one is better. And I assume that there are probably some things where that answer might vary depending on the students and what they and their families want to get. So rather than my saying, unfortunately, this is happening, if I instead relay this as this is something that someone else has said, Smith 2010 argued that school busing in this district was a negative thing for students, then it turns it from being, well, I might just not agree with Basil as the author, to, this person made an argument. What other evidence will be presented here to help convince me that this is the way to go? Now, when you're presenting that evidence, you want to be clear, specific, and to the point. Don't want to be verbose. What does it mean to be verbose or to have verbosity? That's when you start using way too many words to refer to something. So, for example, I have a car. To me, it's just the car. I'll pick you up in my car. Now, I also have a friend who likes to refer to the Super Happy Fun Bus, and it's not a colorful title, but it is inaccurate because it's not a bus. In fact, it's a sedan. And Super Happy Fun Bus is just what they've called cars since they were a little child. So it's both imprecise, kind of inaccurate, and it's also a needlessly verbose way of saying their car. And you could just say Toyota Corolla, and then we know exactly what it was, and there'd be no confusion there. But he goes, Super Happy Fun Bus. All right. So we also want to avoid using metaphors. That would be when you start speaking about something in different language. So, for example, if you are in our counseling program and you say, okay, each appointment is a journey. If we were reading that literally, we'd talk about you going places. And in fact, there is a type of counseling that involves taking people on hikes. And the idea is that you speak more freely because you're doing this physical activity and people let go of things. But if you're not talking about a literal journey, don't use that term because it can cause confusion. So APA style actually prohibits using metaphors. You also want to avoid using non-scholarly sources. What's a non-scholarly source? Well, uh, any old blog on the internet, any casual news site, for example. Generally, scholarly is defined as something that has gone through a process of peer review and that shows its sources. So usually we're talking about journal articles, to some extent books, manuals, government data, things like that. But the general idea is ground your statements. Tell us, okay, what's the basis for this? And make it clear where that recommendation is coming from. Now, sometimes, say if you have a manual for marriage and family therapy, you might not see footnotes the whole time, every page. But if you turn in the back, there'll probably be a list of references showing, okay, here's where this is based on. So because of that, it might not be considered strictly speaking, a peer-reviewed scholarly source, but it might be acceptable for your field and for that assignment. And by citing that, that's a lot better than making an unsupported assertion, because unsupported assertions will read as your opinion, and opinions are easy to dispute. You also want to avoid what we call distracting details. What's a distracting detail? Anything that's not relevant to what we are discussing, what you are trying to convince the reader of. Just like when we were talking about educational history in the United States, it's usually distracting to bring up 19th century one-room schoolhouse because it's just so distant from the current context and arrangement that it's distracting us from the focus on, okay, how can we change things that are going on right now? All right, some practical suggestions for how to do these things in practice. The first one Read the assignment guidelines before you do the reading for the week. Very often in our classes at ACU, the assignments are designed to leverage and use the reading directly, meaning there are certain pieces of information that, to answer the assignment prompts, you will need to find the supporting passages or arguments or evidence in that reading. And yes, you could do the reading, read the assignment, then go back and read it again. But if you look through the assignment first and make up a short list of things that you are looking for, then as you do the reading, you can say, oh, hey, this is one of those things I need. Let me highlight a copy or whatever it is right now and take note of it so I don't need to go back and read this a second time just to find it. Now, how do you know these things and how do you keep track of them? Well, if you take the assignment guidelines and the rubric and you create an outline based on those things, then you will have a document all set up to plug in those pieces of information. For example, I was working with a undergraduate student recently who was taking one of their Bible history classes. And so they were reading different books of the Bible and commentaries about them. And we talked about the assignment guidelines, and they said, okay, so I need a couple examples of Paul talking about his context as the apostle when he was writing the letter. So put that on the outline. I had one space for each example. I think they wanted 3. And something about what's going on in the community, so they put that into the list as well. And then when they went and read the introduction to the letter to the Colossians, they had that list of going. And so when they read the first passage, they realized, oh, in this very first verse, here's one of those things I was looking for. Let me put that in the outline. And so then as they read through, they're paying attention to different details and recording different details than if they had just read through that. Because what we look for, what we pay attention to, has a profound effect on the things that we notice in a text. And if you know you're looking for some things, you can save yourself a lot of time. Another suggestion, make sure that you do exactly what is asked in those instructions first. We have a lot of people who will write their first couple papers and then come in and say, you know, I need help on writing a little bit more concisely. The assignment was to write a 3-page paper. I wrote 6 pages. I'm having trouble cutting it down. And it's not that we can't or won't help you cutting that down. I give advice on that all the time. But that it represents some unnecessary work, things that you didn't have to do. They had 2 paragraphs, almost a whole page, of an introduction that was none of it was asked for in the instructions. And so it ended up being cut. And sometimes those things help you just work out the ideas and get to the point. But if you create an outline first, usually your outline will give you a sense of how things fit together so you can just start writing immediately. Outlines are also good for helping you stay more or less within the target length. If the requirement is no more than 500 words and you come in at 504, usually faculty aren't upset by that. They ask for 500 and you come in with 700, yeah, that's more likely to be an issue. 500 words, by the way, is about 2 double-spaced pages. We talked about being specific as well, so let's talk about being specific to what the genre of writing that you're doing asks you to do. Now, let's go ahead and look at a couple assignments here and look at the genre. So I'm going to go back to my web browser here, and we are going to go ahead and take a look. You should all see my web browser now. We're going to go ahead and take a look at, we'll take Leadership 701. So this is a class that is taken early. It's usually the first class that people take in our EDD program. If you are in a different program and you'd like us to look at a class that you're in right now, just let me know in the chat window, and I'm happy to look at it. But we are going to go ahead and look at Leadership 701. And we're going to go ahead, let's see, we are in week 2 right now. So let's take a look at the assignments here. So week 2, that we have this article analysis. All right, read and carefully consider previous readings on literature searching and academic writing. I'm sorry, we're in week 1 right now, aren't we? Anyway, article analysis. Read and carefully consider previous readings on literature searching and academic writing. All right. Choose a peer-reviewed article related to your topic from the ACU library. Okay. And review an empirical study or literature review from a peer-reviewed scholarly journal published in the United States within the last 5 years. Okay, so we are writing a critical review. What does that mean? Well, there's a whole article about that. But in short, critical means that we are evaluating what works well, what doesn't. Are there important or conspicuous things that they left out? Good things that they included? And overall, you're expected to pass a judgment on, okay, so is this a good source for someone trying to do the thing that you are doing? So let us say that you are a education leadership student and that your goal is to work in, let's say, a public four-year college in Florida. So by choosing that frame, we're drawing a box around the topic and say, all right, there are certain things that you are interested in as a researcher. One of those is general, okay, public US four-year college, sure. But there are also certain regulatory things in Florida about how that university system, college and university system works, and also about the demographics of students there. You might even be what we call hyperlocal. So if you were looking at the landscape of colleges in Miami, major metropolitan area, you could potentially be that specific and be looking at things just informing that context. Or say you were doing Wyoming. Wyoming is a beautiful state. It does not have the same kind of urban concentrations and concentrations of colleges that, say, Florida does. So if you were looking at that, you might say, okay, well, I'm probably not going to find a whole lot written specifically about colleges in Wyoming. So I'm looking for something that's comparable or applicable. And based on that, writing a critical review saying you are trying to inform a study or you're trying to inform a project on Wyoming colleges, there may be things that you are grading by that, or you're evaluating by that rubric of, okay, is this helpful or not helpful in a way that would be different if you were working in the Florida example. All right, let's take a look at another one here. Many of our online classes will have separate discussions and separate papers that you turn in as the quote-unquote written assignments. And you can see here, this is marking a discussion, and this is marking you turn in a paper for it. So let's take a look at this. Some discussions are more reflective and informal, and some of them are more specific. So let's see here. So you're being asked to assess the quality of your own academic writing using this reading as a guide, and to reference this with examples. Okay. So this is reflective. There are going to be a lot of I statements here. For example, I believe that my writing is blah. One thing that I have decided to improve in my reading is blah. And because it's reflective, that kind of phrasing is perfectly appropriate because you're talking about what you believe and your writing and what you planned on doing. And so certainly with that genre, it's a little different than if you were critiquing someone else's writing more abstractly. Because if you're critiquing someone else's writing and you were to say, I don't like how they start this article. First of all, it sounds like you're being subjective and nitpicky. Second, it's not really specific. Now, if you were to phrase your critique saying, the author begins with 6 pages of rambling before they finally introduce the topic of the study, that is specific. And I have read many a study that had that kind of long introduction where you're still wondering, what exactly are they doing before they finally get down to business? So make sure that you are phrasing and things appropriate to the genre that you're being asked to do. Let's head back to our slides. Now, when you're writing a evidence-based essay, that means that you are grounding your arguments first and foremost with evidence. There are different ways that you can refer to evidence, and many of our online students, especially graduate students, are working professionals writing about things in the field that they work with. So there may be cases where you say, in my 5 years of experience as X, in my 3 years of in my 3 years as a premarital counselor, I have often noticed that blah. Or as a vice principal, I frequently field questions from parents about this. So that is an example of how you might be providing evidence from your own experience. Now, it's always helpful when you are referring to your personal experience if you can ground it in the literature when the literature is available. Sometimes people are engaged in the research that they are doing because there is a gap in the literature that they've noticed, and so they have noticed something not aligning in their experience with what is out there, and so they are trying to address that gap. All right, what about number 3? Argumentative essay. An argumentative essay is not so much something about starting an argument with people per se. It's a way of using clear logic and sometimes evidence-based arguments to convince someone of something. Now, we're in a political season right now, so lots of people writing their own miniature argumentative essays on social media. And I'm not going to ask your political affiliations. I'm sure you're surrounded by more than enough of that. But you probably have your own way of where you look at something and you look at it and say, okay, well, are they giving any evidence for that? Doesn't mean that you'll necessarily agree. I've looked at a lot of analyses of presidential debates and things like that to see different people stating who they thought won a particular debate, for example. But the point is to make sure that you back up your claims and you do this with clear logic. If you are writing a testimonial, and there are a bunch of these that come up in our professional master's programs, where you are talking about how your feelings inform things that what you do, or how you've been changed by an event or a situation, you want to make sure that when you're describing your feelings, like, I was very uncomfortable about this, well, develop that a little bit more. I was very uncomfortable about this because X, Y, and Z. Someone said this, which caused me to think that, and then I did the other thing. There are some types of writing where you expect the reader to do a lot of reading between the lines. This is very common in Europe. And one of my colleagues there explained it to me as saying, "Oh, we would never insult the reader by walking them through everything. That'd be insulting their intelligence." And that is one style of writing. But APA style is much more explicit because if you have people read between the lines, they could come to a different conclusion than you do. And that, let's just take an example of, let's go with cars. I went on the Oprah show and I came back with $100. Now, you might say, oh, that was wonderful, $100. But if you say watched the Oprah Winfrey show when there was that episode when everybody got cars, you might think, well, $100, that's going to only be a couple tanks of gas. So make sure that you interpret these events because someone might come up with a different conclusion than you thought. We're wrapping things up here, but a couple suggestions before you submit a paper. First, run a spelling and grammar check. I can't tell you how many times a student has come to me looking to interpret feedback from an instructor and said, hey, I'm not sure why I lost points here. And I look at it and they're just words misspelled right and left, extra spaces, missing punctuation, that just running the spelling and grammar check in Microsoft Word would have helped catch. It's not perfect, but it helps a lot. And really, we want our professors to be focusing on the feedback that they're giving all about the content and not distracting them with errors that 2 minutes might have taken care of. Another useful thing is to read your text out loud. I do this with students when they come and meet me in my office, and I do it when they come and work with me through video chat and even over the phone, because reading the text out loud helps us spot the missing punctuation, words that are missing, words that it's the wrong form, and words that you just add in, not even realizing that they're missing. And it's something where our subconscious mind will fill in the necessary things. But if we're paying attention and you realize, oh, I'm putting in a couple words there each time I read it, yeah, those should probably be written out. You do want to check it to make sure before you turn a paper in, is there a clear answer to each question that was asked? And if they're not questions per se, if there's a prompt, describe this, is it clear that you're doing that in each place? And is that following a clear system of organization? For example, if you start your paper with a paragraph where you give your main idea, and then you have a brief outline of the sections of your paper, do you follow that order? And you can probably guess that many people do not, and that's just confusing. So make sure that those align. It's all right if you come up with a new order, just make sure what you turn in matches and you don't say you're going to talk about this first and then you talk about something else. A area where a lot of people will lose points unnecessarily on the formatting of the references. It's very easy because in APA style, the references section starts on a new page. A lot of people will just paste things over there in whatever format they saw in their reading and think, I'm going to proofread that before I turn this in. And then they're working, they're excited to get finished, and they forget to do that. So I recommend writing these things out on a Post-it because that means that you have a list to check quickly. Okay, have I done this? Have I done that? If the answer is yes, then you move on to the next thing. If you haven't, take stock of what time you have and see if you can do that before you turn it in. Some of these steps, if you're someone who's working in advance and you have a decent draft by, say, Monday morning, before you turn the paper in Monday evening, you could take your lunch break and go through your references or run that spelling and grammar check so that when you are getting close to turning in the paper, you don't have too much to do to take you away to require more time. These things are always a little easier and faster if you do them in a dedicated batch. So if you say, okay, I'm going to sit down here and I'm just going to make sure I get all my references formatted correctly, then it's a lot easier to be in the world of, okay, this is what they look like. And if in doubt, if you find a reference where you say, I don't really know how to format this, you can always send us an email and we're happy to answer that. I get lots of those emails every week. So this concludes the formal part of the webinar. I'll stick around a little bit in case people have questions or want to hear about specific resources. But thank you for attending, and I hope to see you at another webinar soon. One last thing. If you are a new student to ACU, you may not be familiar with our APA course paper template. This is a Word template that I created where you have most of the formatting in APA style, 1-inch margins, 12-point font, separate cover page, separate reference page, where we've done all this before you. Done all this for you to save on time, and you are more than welcome and encouraged to use that. Um, it's not that you can't do all that formatting yourself, but with all the other things going on in the world, if you want to start from the place of, okay, I know what this looks like, this is formatted correctly, that will let you focus on the content more. Thanks for coming, everyone. Have a great day.